How's it going, guys? This is Fusion Hero, and today I'm here bringing you guys a budget deck profile featuring Fallen of Albaz. In fact, with Fallen of Albaz, with this new structure deck release, you can pretty much win. You can essentially win games just by the $30 budget of what the cards give you in a set. And this is kind of like my personal preference. My personal preference. But, you guys can play pretty much whatever you want in it. So, without further ado, let's get started. So, first of all, I run 3 copies of Fallen of Albaz. I know most people run 2 of them, but yeah, it is kind of bricky if you have them in your hand, but because like nowadays in Yu-Gi-Oh, if you go first, you essentially can set up your board and all that stuff. So even if you are going second with this deck somehow and you lose the dice roll or whatnot, then at least this card can essentially play around those cards. Just waste a normal summon and try and negate their baits and or whatnot. Of course, you don't have to play 3, but I just like to play 3 because you're essentially playing Albaz in the deck because that's the whole focus around him. The next off, I also run 3 copies of Spriggans Kit. She's pretty much like one of your best normal summons, besides some other cards. Essentially, what she does is if you control a fusion monster if you have a fusion monster on your field or in your graveyard that mentions Fallen of Albaz as a material, you can special summon her from the hand. And on summon, when she's normal or special summoned, you can take a branded spell trap that's either in your deck, graveyard, or that's face up banished, add it to your hand, then place a card from your hand to the bottom of your deck. So she essentially helps out to get your pretty much like your branded fusion and all your other cards that you have that you can get. And she's pretty much she's pretty much one of your best normal summons to go for. If you don't have her right away, then there's a couple of other options I'll show later. But yeah, so 3 of her. Next off, I also run 2 copies of Tri-Brigade Mercourier. I don't really think running 3 is necessary for this deck because it is pretty much a brick it is essentially a brick if you open multiple copies. I think 2 of them is pretty much okay because it is essentially a hand trap. What it basically says that when your opponent activates a monster effect, while you control a fusion monster that mentions Albaz as a material, quick effect, you can send this card from your hand or face-up field to the grave to negate the effect. So that's pretty much a good thing because most times you want to get your fusions on the field as quickly as possible. And it has the additional effect where if this card is banished, you can basically add to your add from your deck to the hand a Fallen of Albaz or a monster that mentions it from your deck. So this card can also search out Kit, which is a nice little deal. And of course, Fallen of Albaz or whatever. Any monster that mentions it. So quite a nice little touch there. So that card also works out with Albion, the branded dragon too, since you can also banish it for fusion summoning and whatnot. Next off, I also run 1 copy of the Golden Sword Soul. This card is not terrible, but it's also not that great either. Essentially what this card does is when a monster declares an attack, you can special summon it from your hand to negate the attack. And as a bonus, if you control a fusion monster that mentions Albaz as a material, you can destroy the monster that declared that attack. And if a monster or monsters is banished face up, except during the damage step, you could banish this card from your field or graveyard to special summon a light spellcaster from your hand or graveyard whose attack equals its own defense. And that effect is pretty good if you're running multiple copies, but I normally just use it just kind of for like a little, just for like to negate attack. But you guys can run those other cards if you so choose. Then I also run the one copy of Albion, the Shrouded Dragon. This card is pretty much good at one because if you have it, it gives you essentially a Foolish Burial for your branded spell traps, or even Albaz for that matter. Or you can you can also get a free draw with it. Because what it does is it treats itself as Fountain of Albaz while it's on field or grave. And if this card is in your hand or grave, you can send one Fountain of Albaz or a branded spell or trap from your hand or deck to the grave for cost. Then you can apply one of the two effects based off of where the card was sent from. So if it feels from the hand, you get to special summon it. Or if it feels from the deck, you have to place this card to the bottom of your deck. And if you place it from your hand during this time, you get a free draw. So most of the times with this card, I usually just send the branded spell or traps because there's two of the traps because there's two new traps from this structure deck that work really well with that card. All right, so that's pretty much it for the Albaz monster cards. And for the other support, I run 3 copies of Keeper Dragon Magic. This is pretty much like one of your other second best normal summons. So with this card, on summon, it can discard a card to add either a polymerization or either a polymerization normal spell or a fusion normal spell from your deck to the hand. Which obviously branded fusion is a fusion normal spell, so you can search that out with it. And of course, you can also reveal a fusion monster from your extra deck, and it can special summon one monster whose name is specifically listed, or special summon a monster from your graveyard that's specifically listed on that fusion monster. And mainly since the entire deck is revolving around Albaz, you can essentially special summon Albaz from your graveyard. And even though you can only summon out from your X deck, or you can only special summon fusions from your X deck during the turn you activate these effects, but that doesn't matter because you're essentially playing fusions all the time. I also run 2 copies of Summoner Monk. This card is also pretty good too because this card, so by discarding a spell, it can summon out any level 4 monster from your deck. Which means that it can also summon out, Keeper, which you don't really need to, but it can also summon out Spriggans Kit and also Fallen of Albaz, so that you can just get those searches and fusions right off the bat. And I also run 3 copies of Ghost Ogre since you have hand traps in there, why not? And Ghost Ogre is starting to become a pretty effective hand trap nowadays, since it can essentially get rid of monsters that your opponent has. And I know that there's some out there that essentially benefit from being destroyed by card effects and whatnot, but at least it can get rid of them. And of course, triple effect valor, because why not? You basically got free hand traps in the deck, so why not just use them? Alright. And that's pretty much it for the monster lineup. Off to the spells. Pretty much the most broken spell in this entire deck. Triple Branded Fusion. So with this card, so pretty much with Branded Fusion, what I really like about this is that even though it locks you only into fusions into the X deck, but like most people just think like that doesn't really matter because like all you have to do is just activate it. You're only restricted to fusions, and you essentially can go with a whole bunch of combo plays. And I will say I agree with that. So with this card, it fusion summons any fusion that mentions Fallen of Albaz as material from the extra deck, using 2 monsters from your hand, deck, or field as material. You cannot special summon from the extra deck except fusions during the turn you activate it. Yeah, and you have to admit, the artworks on these cards are just beautiful. Like, I don't care how many times I say it, but I just can't help it. This archetype lore just gets better and better. And you pretty much want to maximize yourself on getting branded fusion as much as possible. Then also I run 2 copies of Branded Lost. It's essentially your magical meltdown of the deck, except you don't get any searches on activation. You only get the search. You only get the searches as soon as when you fusion summon. So it only searches out Fallen of Albaz or a monster that mentions it. So essentially you can think of it as like a spell version of the Tri-Brigade bird for this deck. Then I also run 1 Branded Bond, because it can basically special summon Fallen of Albaz that's either banished in your hand or in your graveyard. And if it's sent to the graveyard by Fallen of Albaz's effect, you can set this card to the field. Which of course that level 8 Albion I just showed off just a minute ago. If that card's in the graveyard and you send Branded Bond's effect will trigger off and set itself. Also run 1 copy of Branded in White. I was almost tempted to running 2, but most of the time you just want to get Branded Fusion on the field as quickly as possible. But Branded in White is pretty much like a close second, or I'm not really sure a close second, but it is an okay spell to use. Basically allows you to fusion summon from the X deck using monsters from the hand field, including a dragon type. So essentially it's kind of like a regular poly, but you have to use a dragon to use it. And you can also banish monsters from your graveyard as material if you use Fallen of Albaz as material from the hand field or by banishing it from the grave. And basically it has like the same effect as Branded Bond. If it's sent to the grave by Fallen of Albaz, you can set this card to the field. Not too shabby. And of course I also play a Gold Sark because if you use Gold Sark on the Tri-Brigade monster, then you essentially can get yourself essentially a draw, basically like a pot of green in the deck. And also run Call by the Grave since it's in the deck, and a lot of decks like to use Call by the Grave because And for the traps I run 3 copies of There Can Only Be One. I know some people run 2, but I like to run 3 because most decks are essentially running 1 type of monster, and this card actually doesn't really make your deck that bad, because since we got Albion the Branded Dragon and Lubellion, which are dragon types, but if you fusion summon with their effects for a different type, like it doesn't really matter at that point, because Lubellion can get yourself Mirror Jade, and Albion the same way. Or if you want to go for a different approach, you can go for any of those other types of fusions if you want. It is definitely a good floodgate to use. And next off, I also run 2 copies of Back to the Front, because this card because if you use this card on Albaz, you can just fusion summon on their turn. And I also run 3 copies of Warning Point. Essentially when a monster is summoned, it just can't be used as material. So you can think of it as basically like a trap version of no material. It just cannot be. Its effects are negated, so it's kind of like a built-in impermanence, but also cannot be used as a fusion, synchro, exes, or link material. Because most decks don't really tribute summon anymore. But most of the times they're always using the X deck, so Warning Point is definitely a good support card for this deck. And for the last traps, I run 1 Retribution and 1 Sword. So basically with these cards, I like running them because, well, Retribution is essentially a solemn for the deck, and when you banish it from the graveyard for its effect, it can it can add back any branded spell or trap from the grave to the hand, which is nice. Yeah, but for like the solemn effect of it, it says when a spell, trap, or a monster effect is activated that includes the effect of a special summon, you can either return a fusion monster you control that mentions Albaz's material you control to the deck, or 2 from the graveyard. And that's pretty good because if you're sending a crap load of fusions to your graveyard, returning those 2 fusions from the graveyard is definitely a nice little touch there. So you can just keep recycling them over and over. And with Branded Sword, I don't really use the first effect of that, where you can banish any number of branded spell traps to summon out Ice Blade tokens. But I've only done that like maybe once. But the second effect is where I really care. The second effect, by banishing this card from the grave, you can target one of your Fallen of Albaz or a monster that mentions it and add it to the hand. And that's actually one of the combo pieces with the Tri-Brigade bird, which I'll just kind of showcase at the end of this, toward the end of the video. And so that's pretty much it for the main deck. And now for the extra deck, I run 3 copies of Mirror Jade, pretty much like the best boss monster for this deck. What it does is you can only control one of them, but during either player's turn as a quick effect, you can send one fusion monster that mentions Albaz's material for an extra deck to the grave to banish any monster on the field, and it's non-targeting, which is amazing. And not only that, if this fusion summon card leaves the field either by battle or by your opponent's card, it essentially Regekis your opponent during the end phase. Which, if they don't have a response to that, or if they have cards to protect themselves from destruction, then they essentially lose their whole board. Then next, I also run triple Lubellion, because this card essentially works well with dark attribute monsters that you run even in competitive plays, especially with Despia. So pretty much when it's fusion summon, it has the same on summon effect as Albaz. By discarding a card, you get the fusion summon. This one shuffles from the field, graveyard, and your banish zone, which is quite nice. And it summons out only level 8 or lower fusion monsters except himself. But you just cannot attack with Lubellion during the turn you activate it, and you're only restricted to fusions once you activate it. Then, next off, I also run triple Albion, the Branded Dragon. Albion's a pretty damn good card. Essentially, it has the same effect as Lubellion, but without discarding. When it's fusion summoned, it essentially is a miracle fusion for your cards. By banishing from the hand, field, and graveyard to summon out a level 8 or lower fusion from the extra deck, other than himself. And if this card is sent to the graveyard during the end phase, you get to either add or set a branded spell or trap from the deck, which is definitely a nice little touch, since this deck pretty much needs it if you're playing a budget version. Or hell, even if you're not playing budget. But, yeah. But you have to admit, like, these artworks are just amazing looking. Sorry if I keep mentioning that, but it's the truth. Alright, then I also run triple Spriggans, the Iron Dash Dragon. With this card, it says during your main phase, you can move this card to your main monster zone. Then you can destroy all other face-up cards in its column. And also during the end phase, if this card is sent to the grave, you get to either add or special summon one Spriggans monster or Fallen of Albaz from the deck, which essentially gives your Spriggans Kit a little boost. Because when you special summon Kit, you then get yourself a branded spell trap back, which is nice. Then next, I run 2 copies of Brigrand, the Glory Dragon. So essentially with this card, it cannot be destroyed by battle, and while you control this fusion summon card, your opponent cannot target other monsters you control with monster effects, which is really nice. So it gives your Mirror Jade some targeting protection. And during the and pretty much like with Spriggans and Albion, when this card is sent to the grave during the end phase, this card allows you to either add or special summon a Brigrand monster or Fallen of Albaz from the deck. Then, for the last one, I run one Titaniclad, the Ash Dragon. I don't really summon him that often, but I just kind of have him, for more of like a ditch play for Mirror Jade if I wanted to. So, and pretty much when it's sent to the grave, just kind of like with Brigrand and Sprind, you can either add a Dogmatica monster or Fallen of Albaz, but honestly, this deck doesn't have Dogmatica monsters, so you can't really use it for anything. But, yeah. So that's pretty much it from my deck. So that's it from my $30 budget deck. So if you like it, then leave a like down below and comment what you think. So, have a good day.